"She will come through that door before midnight," the Duke of Alderness said, "and when she does, not one man under this roof will lay a hand upon her." The innkeeper of the Grayling Arms turned his hat round and round in his fingers and said nothing at all, which Anselm counted a species of wisdom. Rain had been falling on the North Road since noon. It came at the windows in long grey sheets, and with every hour the ditches ran deeper and the horses went slower, and with every hour Anselm sat by the fire with his gloves still in his hand and did not move. He had learned patience the hard way, in rooms where moving first had cost him a great deal. 11 days he had spent arranging this night. A coachman on the Hollowford stage had been paid to remember one particular face, and to forget one particular pursuit. A turnpike keeper had 5 guineas in his coat to raise his gay after dark, without questions, for any woman travelling alone. A chambermaid at the Swan had been told only this, that if a young lady came down asking which road ran north, she was to answer the North Road, and answer it kindly. He had made one path easy and every other path hard, and he had done it without letting his name be spoken once. "You are sure of the turn, your grace?" the innkeeper ventured. "I am sure of nothing," Anselm said. "I have only made it likely." Men called him cold. He had never troubled to correct them. Coldness was a serviceable coat, and he had worn worse ones. It kept the curious at a distance and the greedy at 2. But a cold man may still count hours, and Anselm had counted every one since a letter reached him a fortnight since, in a lawyer's cramped hand, telling him that Miss Sibylla Thorne of Hollowford was to be married on Thursday to Sir Denby Crail. The arithmetic of it had been simple and filthy. Her uncle, Mr. Hallam Thorne, owed £1,100 he could not pay. Sir Denby held the notes. Sir Denby had offered to burn them and had named his price, and the price had a face and a name, and had sat in Hollowford church 3 Sundays running while the banns were read over her head like a sentence. On Tuesday she had run. Anselm tore his gloves over. He had considered writing to her. He had got as far as taking up the pen twice, and twice he had set it down, because he knew precisely how such a letter would read to a woman with a wedding 3 days off and no friend in the world, a duke she had never been introduced to, offering protection. She would have burned it and been right too, so he had not written. He had built her a road instead, and come to stand at the end of it. The fire dropped. Somewhere above, a door shut, and a maid's feet went along the boards. Anselm found himself thinking, as he had thought too often in 3 winters, of the assembly rooms at Marchfield. He had arrived late that night and unannounced, which was his habit, and he had been standing in the passage while his brother's name went round the room. Edwin had been 6 weeks dead. The story then current was that he had died a thief. The truth, which required more patience than the room possessed, was that Edwin had stood surety for other men until it killed him. Anselm had heard the laughter start. And then, over the top of it, a young woman's voice, quite clear, and not raised at all. "Whatever the world chooses to say of Lord Edwin Rue, he stood surety for my father when the bank would not, and I will not sit in a warm room and hear him called a thief." He had not gone in. He had stood in the dark of the passage and watched a girl in a mended gown say the only decent thing that had been said of his brother in 6 weeks. He had watched the fans come up. He had watched the space around her widen by a foot, and then by 2, and he had watched no man ask her to dance for the remainder of the evening. Her aunt had taken her home before supper. He had learned her name from a footman and had never once said it aloud. He had not courted her. A duke's notice would have finished what the fans began. He had done the only thing he could do, which was to keep an eye upon the Thorne family's affairs at a distance, through a lawyer, like a coward or a sentinel, and he had been too slow, and Sir Denby Crail had been quicker, and now there was rain on the North Road and a woman somewhere out in it. The door of the Grayling Arms banged back against the wall. She came in with the weather behind her. Her cloak was grey and had been soaked so long that it had gone nearly black, and the hem of it hung heavy with mud to the knee. Her bonnet was gone. Her hair had come down in dark wet ropes over one shoulder. She was shaking with cold and with something a good deal better than cold, and in her right fist, held low and level and pointed at the room, was a hatpin 6 inches long. The innkeeper made a small sound. Anselm did not move at all. She saw the fire first and the innkeeper second, and then she saw him standing beyond the settle with his gloves in his hand, and every scrap of colour went out of her face. "You are Alderness," she said. He inclined his head. "I am. I have seen you at Marchfield. Her chin came up. The hatpin did not waver. Sir Denby sent you. No. Then explained the turnpike. Anselm said nothing for a moment, because it was a fair question, and because she had asked it before she had asked for a chair or a fire, and that told him a great deal about the 2 days behind her. Explain it, she said again. The gate at Coombe stood open at 11 o'clock at night, and the man in it looked at my face and not at my purse. The Hollowford coachman would not take my money. The maid at the Swan told me which road ran north before I had finished asking her. 2 days I have been running, your grace, and every yard of it has been too easy. Her voice cracked, and she mastered it and went on. A road as easy as that has been swept. I should like to know who held the broom. I did, Anselm said. The fire spat. The innkeeper went out very quietly and drew the door to behind him. She had gone quite white, and she did not run, which he thought afterwards was the bravest thing he had ever watched done in a public room. She only set her back against the wall, as any sensible creature will, and looked at him with her father's ruin and her uncle's debt and 3 Sundays of banns standing behind her eyes. Then you have bought me, she said, and I have been walking to you all this while. Anselm crossed to the table. He took a folded paper from his breast and laid it upon the boards. Then he stepped back 3 full paces and put his hands behind him, where she could see them. Read that, he said. Then tell me what I am. She did not come to the table for a long moment. When she did, she kept the hatpin in her left hand and unfolded the paper with her right, and Anselm watched her read by firelight with rain running off her hem onto the boards. There were 2 sheets. The first was her uncle's note of hand for £1,100, endorsed over in a clerk's copperplate to Anselm Roux, Duke of Alderness, purchased its full face value 11 days since. The second was shorter and in Anselm's own writing, and it discharged the whole sum to Mr. Hallam Thorne and his heirs forever, requiring nothing of any person living. She read it twice. Then she said in a flat, careful voice, "It wants a witness." "It does." He went to the door and called the innkeeper back, and the man came in wiping his hands and signed his name where he was told, and looked at neither of them, and went out again. Anselm thought he would remember that small scratching sound for the rest of his life. "There is a third paper," she said, "under the others. Sir Denby's settlement. His attorney's copy. It came into my hands with the notes." She picked it up between 2 fingers as though it were something dead, and carried it to the hearth, and fed it to the fire, and stood with her arms folded until it had gone entirely to ash. Anselm did not offer to help her do it. Some things a person must burn with her own hands. "What do you want?" she said, not turning round. "Tonight? That you sit down before you fall down." She sat. The innkeeper's wife brought soup and a dry cloak, and Sibylla Thorne ate like a woman who had not eaten since Tuesday, which she had not, and Anselm looked at the fire and gave her the courtesy of not watching her do it. When the bowl was empty, he set 2 things on the table. "There is a carriage at 6, he said. "It goes north to Kelsden. With it there is a draft on my bank for £200 and a letter to a Mrs. Ardley, who keeps a girls' school there, and who owes me nothing and likes me less, so you may trust her. You would be at liberty entirely. I should never call, and you would never hear my name again from any quarter." He turned the second paper round. "Or there is Alderness, 40 miles east. My housekeeper is Mrs. Pell, and she has a tongue like a rasp, and no use for me at all. The door's locked from the inside. You would stay as long as you liked, and my name would sween you and Sir Denby until he grew tired of it." Sibylla looked at the 2 papers for a long time. "Which would you have me choose?" "That," said Anselm, "is not a question I have any right to answer." She chose Alderness. When he asked her why later, she said, "Because I am tired of running in a straight line." The house took her in the way old houses do, grudgingly and then completely. Mrs. Pell put her in the south rooms where the sun came in and made a great show of disapproving of everybody. Anselm took his dinner in the library the first week entire, so that she should not have to sit at a duke's table and be grateful, and when he came down on the 8th morning he found snowdrops in a chipped cup on his desk, and a page of the Home Farm accounts turned back with a pencil line under a figure that had been wrong for 2 years. He did not move the cup. It sat there until the flowers died, and then he had it filled again. Sir Denby Crail came on the 9th day. Anselm received him in the great hall, standing, and did not offer him a chair. Krail was a florid, well-made man who smiled easily, and he spoke of his promised wife and of a young lady's nerves and of the folly of women, and Anselm let him get to the end of it. "Mr. Thorn's notes are discharged," Anselm said. "You are owed nothing by any person in this house or in Hollowford. There is no promise. There was never a promise. There was a purchase, and the money has been returned to you with interest, and my attorney has your receipt." The smile stayed where it was. By Friday, Krail said pleasantly, "Every drawing-room between here and London will know that Miss Thorne spent a night at an inn and 9 days beneath a bachelor's roof." "Say it where I can hear it," Anselm said, "and I will answer it in the Lords and the newspapers, and afterwards at whatever hour and place you find convenient. Consider how it will sound. Read aloud, Sir Denby. That you bought a gentleman's debts in order to purchase his niece, and that when the debt was paid you thought the girl still yours." He rang the bell. "The road south is not swept. You will find it rough going." Krail went. Anselm turned and found Sibylla halfway down the staircase with her hand on the rail, and knew that she had heard all of it. She sat down on the stair. "Why," she said, "you have never spoken 20 words to me in your life. Why me?" So he told her about Marchfield, the passage and the laughter, and a clear voice saying his brother's name as though it were still worth something. He told her that no man had asked her to dance for the rest of that evening, and that he had stood in the dark and let it happen, because his notice would have made it worse, and because he had been a coward in a very well-cut coat. "You did not know I was in the passage," he said. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them as though they belonged to somebody else. "I was not brave," she said. "I was angry. I have found the two are often the same coat, worn different ways." The next morning he had the travelling carriage brought round to the door, with the draft and the letter to Mrs. Ardley laid upon the seat, and he stood in the courtyard in the cold with his hat in his hand. "It stands," he said. "Kelsden and £200, and never a word from me again. I would rather you took it than that anyone alive, including you, could say a road was swept." Sibylla came out onto the step in Mrs. Pell's borrowed shawl. She looked at the carriage a long while. Then she went and shut the door of it with a small definite click, and came back and stood in front of him. "You have arranged a great many roads, your grace. I will not arrange this one." "Then arrange nothing," she said, "and say the thing plainly, as you have said everything else." He found that plainness was harder than he had supposed. "I have watched you for 3 winters," Anselm said, "and never once been properly introduced. Miss Thorne, my name is Anselm." She laughed, and her eyes were wet, and the sound of it went through that grey courtyard like a window opening. "Then ask me in the morning, Anselm, when I am not standing in the rain," she said, "and ask me again afterwards. I mean to say yes twice." They were married in March in the chapel at Alderness, with Mrs. Pell weeping furiously and denying it, and the bride carrying snowdrops because there was nothing else out yet, and she would have nothing else. Her uncle came, and was forgiven more than he deserved, which Anselm thought was very like her. The world went on calling him the cold Duke of Alderness. He permitted it. It kept the curious at a distance and the greedy at 2, and not one of the people who said it had ever stood in the long gallery at dusk and watched him set down his pen and turn, without being called, at the sound of his wife crossing the room,